Hi. Hey, hello, back there. Nice to see you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Paul Baudet, the Executive Director of Wilberforce Foundation based here in Seattle, and I am delighted to have the most coveted post-lunch speaking role. So thank you for indulging me. I've had the pleasure of serving as chair of the host committee for this year's Learning Conference. So I'm delighted to welcome you to Seattle. I've been part of the GEO community pretty much since GEO was founded and have been to pretty much every national conference, including one that happened, the first one that happened here in 2004 that was referenced earlier this morning. And at that conference, two very close friends of mine found each other, fell in love, and got married. So I just want to let you know that if you're here and single, swipe right for GEO. So when GEO asked me, and I also want to pay homage to our morning speaker with my little C creativity. What do you think? And that's not a tribute to my design sense. It's because I just moved from Capitol Hill to Ballard and everything's in boxes, and this was the first pair of socks I could find. So GEO asked me to welcome you all, and there was a list of things they wanted me to do. So to welcome you, share what I hoped you'd gain from your time in Seattle, include personal recommendations, and add anything I wanted you to know about the significance of being in the city. So I prepared a lovely 148-slide presentation deck, and then I got the email that said, oh, and you have 2 minutes to do all that. So I'm not doing the slide deck, but it would have been terrific. You would have loved it. It would have moved very quickly. So instead, I'd like to capture the essence of Seattle with 3 short haiku, the short poetic form. The first has the added benefit of being an acrostic homage to our host today. So, number 1, glorious vistas enrich our experience of Salish homelands. Number 2, yes, it's beautiful, but please tell your friends back home it always rains here. And my final one, Starbucks is local, Amazon will deliver. Let's see what happens. Okay. Oh, yeah, soy, delicious. So there are many people and organizations that help make this conference possible. First, I want to thank Philanthropy Northwest, again, for their partnership and support in bringing the conference to Seattle. As the host of the committee, or as the chair of the host committee, scrambled that, I had the pleasure of working with many of my colleagues here in Seattle for this conference. So I want to offer additional thanks to those colleagues. They spent time helping plan the conference, review conference proposals, offered insights to local speakers, and provided financial support. So can I please ask all the members of the local host committee to stand again so we can thank you for your work making sure this conference happened. So. Thank you. So, before we bring up our panel, we'd like to take time for a special presentation. Candid, formerly Foundation Center, launched the Open for Good Award to encourage foundations to practice greater transparency about what they're learning and what has not worked. The Open for Good Award celebrates organizations sharing knowledge to build a stronger philanthropic sector. So I'd like to invite Janet Camarena of Candid, Meg Long of Equal Measure, and Claire Nolan of Engage to take the stage to present the Open for Good Award.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much to GEO for giving Candid a part of today's agenda to celebrate knowledge sharing champions. And also a big thanks to the Fund for Shared Insight for supporting Open for Good tools. And let me hear how, this is the right room for learning and knowledge. So how about 3 cheers for knowledge sharing champions? Before we get into Open for Good, I realize some of you might be hearing Candid and not know what that is since we're pretty new. So earlier this year, Foundation Center and GuideStar joined forces and created a new organization called Candid. And our mission is to connect people who want to change the world to the resources they need to do it. When people hear that word resources in our mission, they usually think funding and dollars. But as folks at a learning conference will appreciate, knowledge is a resource too. However, I was recently startled to hear knowledge is obsolete. As a librarian, my ears perked up at this TEDx talk. It seemed plausible. Why memorize facts when anything anyone wants to know can be readily looked up on the go via a smartphone? What an exciting time to be alive, a time when all of humanity's knowledge is at our fingertips. Leading experts are just a swipe away. The answer always literally close at hand. And we've been released from the drudgery of memorization and graduated to a life of active, informed debate. And how lucky are we to be working in philanthropy and able to leverage all of this knowledge for good, right? Though the active debate might sound familiar, sadly for those of us working in philanthropy, the abundance of knowledge remains more sci-fi mirage than a TED Talk rendering of our present-day reality. Candid data tells us that of the annual $5 billion in foundation grants for knowledge creation, such as evaluations and case studies, only a very small fraction of them are shared at all, and far fewer through any kind of central open repository. This means that the knowledge is fragmented, scattered across thousands of different websites, if it's even there at all, since Candid data also tells us that the vast majority of foundations don't have websites, making this knowledge an impossible task to discover. No coincidence, perhaps, that a main finding of a recent field scan about knowledge use in philanthropy was that foundation professionals looking to gain and share knowledge tend to prefer to confer with trusted foundation peers and colleagues. At the same time, the field is doing a lot of soul searching related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what it can do to improve. But if funders in the field are only sourcing knowledge from known peers, doesn't that suggest their knowledge networks may be unintentionally insular and lacking in diversity of perspective? And might there be a way to connect the dots and improve the effectiveness and inclusivity of our networks by changing the way we source, find, and share lessons learned? In other words, shouldn't what we know not just be about who we know? This aim for a collective approach is at the heart of Open for Good. 3 Candid services are leveraging their platforms and offering free tools to advance the idea that philanthropy can best live up to its promise of serving the public good by openly and consistently sharing what it's learning from its work. Issue Lab is a searchable archive that supplies easy open access to social sector knowledge. The site includes a growing curated collection of evaluations that we hope you will all use and add to. Glass Pockets helps foundations use technology to improve their transparency and openness. And I encourage you to use the assessment that's there to determine whether your foundation has glass pockets and to learn how clear that glass is. And we launched an Open for Good Grantcraft guide that you can freely download filled with advice and examples of how to operationalize knowledge sharing. Today's Open for Good Award was born out of these efforts to recognize and encourage greater knowledge sharing in the field. So we scanned the field looking for knowledge sharing champions, starting with those foundations publicly sharing their transparency assessments in glass pockets, then looked at a subset of these who were contributing their knowledge via Issue Lab's open archive, and examined a global set of submitted nominations to identify finalists for consideration by our external committee. The award criteria included evidence of an active commitment to open knowledge, creative approaches to making knowledge shareable, field leadership, and incorporating community insights into knowledge sharing work. Our committee identified 3 winners, and I'll be kicking us off by introducing the first of these, Though I should mention we're announcing these in no particular order. It's not a ranked prize. Our first award winner stood out to the committee for a number of reasons. This foundation displays its commitment to creating a culture of learning by regularly hosting grantee convenings for the purpose of knowledge exchange. They're a pioneer in helping to spread the idea of foundation transparency globally as the first foundation in their country to take the Glass Pockets Transparency Assessment. And this foundation routinely publishes summaries from all of its grantee reports for each portfolio as a way to support shared learning among its grantees. It's actually a refreshing reinvention of the traditional grantee report, placing priority on collecting and sharing the kinds of information that will be helpful to other practitioners, rather than questions to satisfy the typical ritual of a grant report that usually goes something like submit, data enter, file away, never to be seen, and repeat. Our first winner is the Ian Potter Foundation, an Australian foundation that supports and promotes excellence and innovation, working for a vibrant, healthy, fair, and sustainable Australia. Beyond being, yes, you can cheer. Beyond being transparent with its grantee reports, the Ian Potter Foundation also recently helped lift the burden on its grantees when it comes to outcomes. Instead of asking overworked charities to invent a unique set of metrics just for their grant process, Foundation evaluation staff took it upon themselves to mine the Sustainable Development Goals framework and provided grantees with optional and ready-made outcomes templates that would work across the field for many organizations and funders. So again, let's hear some cheers for these practices that have led to efficiency, scaled knowledge, and empathy for grantee partners. The Ian Potter Foundation was unable to be here today, but to kick us off, we have a video acceptance to share featuring Craig Connolly, Chief Executive Officer for the Ian Potter Foundation. And this is the tech magic part of the presentation.
Hello, my name is Craig Connolly, Chief Executive Officer of the Ian Potter Foundation. On behalf of the Foundation, I'm delighted to accept this Open for Good award. Over the last 4 years, the Ian Potter Foundation has been focusing on improving our transparency. This has mainly been achieved by sharing our learnings as a funder and the learnings of our many grantees. In 2017, we were pleased to become the first Australian philanthropic foundation to meet the criteria for the Foundation Centre's Glass Pockets initiative, and hope that this encourages other foundations in Australia to do the same. I can't be there tonight in person, but we're very happy to now receive this inaugural Open for Good award. It's not only a great acknowledgement of what our team has achieved to date, but it strengthens our resolve to strive for greater transparency in our grant making. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
I'd like now to turn it over to one of our committee members, Claire Nolan, to introduce our next award winner. Claire wears many hats. She is co-founder of Engage R&D, author of our Open for Good Grantcraft Guide, and one of the leaders of the Funder Evaluation Affinity Network, which has been playing an active role in helping to improve the practice and impact of foundation evaluation. Please help me in welcoming Claire Nolan.
Thank you, Janet. I am very pleased to be a part of this effort, as I truly believe that knowledge has the power to spark change, but only if it's shared. Through our work on the Grantcraft Guide on knowledge sharing and the Funder and Evaluator Affinity Network, I have seen a growing hunger in our field to connect and share knowledge beyond traditional boundaries. Our second award winner stood out to our committee for several reasons. First, it received multiple nominations, including from community groups and grantees, demonstrating that its knowledge has definitely had impact outside foundation walls. One example of what we heard from these stakeholders about why this foundation deserves the award was, in sum, it behaves like an organization trying to achieve something and aware of its own ignorance. And it doesn't, unlike many foundations, behave like Louis XIV. I love this example because it shows the paradox that to create a culture of learning, perhaps the first step is to admit what we don't know. Secondly, this foundation also represents the field of corporate philanthropy, in which grant-making teams are often so lean that they don't have capacity for monitoring, evaluation, and sharing. But not so with this grant maker, who has made becoming a learning organization core to its work. It is another international player with operations spanning the globe. And most uniquely in our field, this funder is not shy about sharing what it has learned from its mistakes and struggles. I won't keep you in suspense any longer. Our next winner is the C&A Foundation. The C&A Foundation is a corporate foundation working to fundamentally transform the fashion industry. C&A gives its partners financial support, expertise, and networks so they can make the industry work better for every person it touches. Some of its signature programs include gender justice, accelerating sustainable cotton, improving working conditions, and eradicating forced and child labor from the fashion supply. Lessons learned for each of its program areas are clearly available on its website, and top-level summaries are provided for every impact evaluation, making findings accessible to peers, grantees, and other stakeholders. It even provides summaries for efforts that didn't go as planned, which is commendable and requires a certain kind of negotiation with one's grantees to really make those transparent. Here to accept the award on behalf of the C&A Foundation is Savi Mal, Senior Evaluation Manager, who made the journey to GEO all the way from India. Please help me in welcoming her to the stage and congratulating C&A for being open for good.
This is such a proud moment for C&A Foundation. I'm actually very thrilled to be receiving this award. We are a very young corporate foundation founded in 2011, and it was only in 2014 that we made this commitment to be transparent about our results, come success, or even failure. And because it is only by sharing our results and what we are learning that we can strengthen our field and hold ourselves to account. And that is why all our evaluations are published online, and they're also on Issue Lab. This we also believe is very bold, because in the field of philanthropy, not everyone is as candid as they need to be. And the current global challenges that we are facing, be it climate change, inequality, or even in our case, putting the fashion industry on a sustainable path, all of these challenges, addressing these challenges, are dependent on us being open about our results. So I would like to take this opportunity to invite all of those foundations that are struggling to be transparent to embrace openness. Please don't be shy. And lastly, making this possible are my colleagues, Lee Alexander Risby, the head of Effective Philanthropy, and João Martino, and alongside our foundation leadership team, who are pivotal in driving this cultural shift towards openness. I'd also like to make a special mention for our partners who are brave and who are embarking on this journey of transparency with us. On behalf of C&A Foundation, thank you very much for the award.
Thank you, Savi. And for the final award, I would like to pass the mic to Meg Long, President of Equal Measure, my funder, evaluator, and Affinity Network partner, and a long-standing champion of the field of philanthropic evaluation.
Thank you, Claire. In addition to sharing lessons and knowledge gained to strengthen philanthropic practice, a key tenet of the Funder Evaluator Affinity Network is to support the infrastructure and incentivize collaboration for stronger field impact amongst evaluators and funders. I'm thrilled to share the stage with Janet and Claire and our awardees, and I'm also congratulating GEO and Candid for this collaboration on stage today. Our final award winner impressed our committee because they're aware of their leadership position and they use this influence to model knowledge sharing as a field asset, not just as an internal asset. This foundation also boasts early adopter status to transparency and openness, and was one of the very first foundations to join Glass Pockets and to commit to Open for Good principles by sharing its published evaluations widely. This foundation also took the unusual step of upping the ante on the Open for Good pledge, stating, and I quote, "To ensure that we hold ourselves to a high bar, our foundation pre-commits itself to sharing the results of its evaluations well before the results are known. This way, ensuring that even if the evaluation findings are unfavorable, they will be shared." I won't keep you in suspense any longer. Our final winner of the inaugural Open for Good Prize is the Rockefeller Foundation. Since its founding more than 100 years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation's mission to promote the well-being of humanity throughout the world has remained unchanged. In Glass Pocket's Transparency Talk post, Rockefeller's monitoring and evaluation team underscored the connection between knowledge sharing and advancing funders' goals. Through the documentation of what works, for whom, and how and under what conditions, there's potential to amplify impact by crowding in other funders to promising solutions and diverting resources from being wasted on approaches that prove ineffectual. Their use of Issue Lab's open knowledge platform is living up to its promise, as anyone can currently query and find more than 400 knowledge documents funded, published, or co-published by the Foundation. Here to accept the award for the Rockefeller Foundation is Veronica Olazabal, Director of Measurement, Evaluation, and Organizational Performance for the Rockefeller Foundation. Please help me in welcoming Veronica.
Thank you. I'm happy, I'm excited, I'm thrilled to be accepting this award on behalf of my colleagues at the Rockefeller Foundation, some who are sitting out there with me as well. I only have 2 minutes to say 3 things, so I'll try to make it quick. First, around prioritization. For the last 105 years, the Rockefeller Foundation has prioritized sharing of our learning as part of how we show up in the world and how we do good. One way is through our pre-commitment, as mentioned earlier, in sharing our evaluation findings. We see this as a way to maximize the usage as well as to contribute to the public good. And my predecessor, Nancy McPherson, who many of you know, really drove that into our institutional ethos. Another way is to ensure that the data we generate and fund is made available through our new data assets policy, which, while complicated to implement, will ensure that our data is being both generated in a responsible way of good quality and open for good to the public. This is a team sport, and our goal is for us all to learn together. And our vision is to see our sector grow and continue to move in this direction of generating knowledge and evidence for the public good. So with that said, I'll close my remarks and thank you all.
Was that the Jaws theme music? So thank you. It was really inspiring to hear the stories of the award recipients. Now I'd like to bring up the moderator for today's panel conversation. Geraldine Coffey is founder and director of the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. Jera's leading work that sits at the intersection of equity and evaluation. Along with practice partners at the initiative, they're considering the implications of equity for evaluation practice. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Please join me in welcoming Geraldine Coffey and the speakers to the stage.
Okay, great. everybody. Hello. So I was remarking in the restroom, because I think that's the best way to start a plenary, that if you've ever tried to get a session into Geo, it's a lot of work. And so they asked, and I thought, well, great. And so I get an email, and it says, you've been rejected. And I had feelings. There may have been words that are not appropriate in a professional setting. And then the next 2 lines were, we'd like to invite you to a plenary. I also had feelings. And so now we're here. So thank you, Geo. Geo is also a field partner of the Equitable Evaluation Initiative. That doesn't mean we don't have to go through the same hoops as everybody else. But what I do appreciate is that they are sharing our work with the larger field. So I'm really excited about that. So today, it's never about me. Anyone who knows that. It's never about me. It's really about the opportunity for us to share with you some work that some of your partners are doing, your peers are doing. They are early adopters in thinking about the relationship between equity and evaluation and learning and inquiry, and how we can actually rethink our relationship to evaluative practice so that it's in service of, not just measuring something. I could go on about that, but that's for later. So the equitable evaluation principles, I should say this is the 3rd time we've actually been at Geo. The first time we got 75 minutes. The second time we got a half a day. And now we are over lunch. So I'm not really sure if we're moving up or down. But still, we get all of you, which is exciting. So the thing about the principles are that if you believe in the first one, it changes absolutely everything. Evaluation work is in service of and contributes to equity. Mic drop, right? I serve on the board of the American Evaluation Association. We talk about this, but evaluation as a field hasn't quite taken a stance to be in service of something more than knowledge. Veronica, that's true, right? Okay, great. Awesome. So if you believe in the first one, the next 2 principles are no-brainers, that you have to understand those 3 things. And as evaluators, it's our obligation to deliver on them, whether you as clients ask for them or not, which is a tricky business model question, obviously. But still, if we are in the business of being transformational and affecting change, it's part of our job to lift up things perhaps that are not seen. And then the last one is really about how do we address validity? How do we expand our notion of validity to be beyond that of statistical and really understand some of the dimensions of power, of place, of voice, of trust? And then oriented towards participant ownership so that evaluation is no longer the typically extractionary science that it is. Sometimes it feels a little better, but at the end of the day, the data usually sits someplace else. And so what we're going to talk about today is we're actually going to share what these practice partners have done to actually advance these principles in their own places of work. We have a semi-structured conversation. It's really designed to answer some of the questions that people ask us all the time, which is, how do you get started? Why did you get started? What's happening now? And then we'll open up the floor, and I think it will be Cassie and Emily will help sort some questions. I think that is it. Oh, this is also important, and I think this is, if you know anything about the initiative, is that we really believe that this is a paradigm shift, and it really requires an understanding that equity, or the opposite of it, really has affected everything in every way in which we think in this country. And so because evaluative work is so tricky and filled with so much feeling and challenge and trauma, depending on the populations, we have found that those people who see and understand the ways in which dominant culture and really white supremacy and patriarchy have altered every single way in which we think about things, once you get that, you have to do something different. It's like a non-negotiable. You can't unsee that. And so we have been seeking partners who got that, and for these 3, for them, once that became clear, they realized that their evaluative work had to change. So the structure today is really the questions are really around sort of how to make the case. So they're each going to share a little bit about how the case was made and really at a personal level. talk a little bit about equipping for transformation, because of course we have a theory of change, and then where are they in adopting EE principles. This is, again, long-term marathon work. We are making progress, but we are nowhere near where we need to be because we actually need more people to engage in this work because context matters. So when you listen to the three of them, I want you to be thinking about ways in which their experiences and their context, their themes that may relate to your work, and perhaps you can find some entry points as well. And because context matters and history matters, as I introduce them, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we came to meet. Are you ready? Okay, it's pretty PG. Okay, so Marcy, I'll do the full thing. I should read all your stuff, right? You don't want me to read all your stuff? All right, so I'm not going to read all your stuff. You guys know who they are, right? You can read it. Okay, so Marcy and I met at AEA in 2016 at the bar. Not during a session, after a session, want to be super clear about that. And we remarked on each other's conference bags. And then we discussed the criteria, because we're evaluators, by which we selected a good travel bag. And so that's how I met Marcy. Trilby's a Twitter friend. She reached out, and I was like, oh, okay. She seemed lovely, as most Canadians are. I'm just going to say that. I find them to be a lovely people. And so we met. She was coming to that super secret Left Coast Evaluator thing. And so we met, and we had a lovely meal, and we talked about a whole host of things about the Canadian context. We talked about how they dropped colonialism like in every other word, which was like incredible in 2017, right? I was like, wow, you guys talk about that? We don't talk about that here. You're fun. I want to come play with you. And then Han. So when I was trying to figure out, I might get teary. So when I was trying to figure out what on earth this evaluation thing was and what do you do as a African-American woman trying to make difference for my people, the multicultural evaluation monograph came out. And I was like, there's a bright light. There is hope. And then Han, when she was at SPRA, we shared some common clients, and that's when I fell in love. I fell in love often, so I'm just going to say that. And then when she went to the foundation, which was a super smart choice on their part, we started a relationship again around EEI. And so the fact that I'm actually on the stage with you is really a little bit overwhelming. So thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Okay. All right, so we have a couple questions. Oh, well, yeah, we have a couple questions. So the first question is, what brought you to EEI, and how did the principles resonate with you personally and professionally?
It's true that I was not born in California.
I know, I think it's supposed to be Han. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what's going on. Yeah, so go ahead. No, it's you.
Oh, you want me to go first? Okay.
Yeah, because the slides are the way the slides are. I can't
Okay,
do
and
anything about it now.
I actually take responsibility for this question. First, I just want to thank Jara because I consider you a lifelong friend and colleague.
Aw,
So
thanks.
just thank you for your tireless work around EEI.
Thank you.
And I also warn you, I cry ugly and she cries pretty. So if I cry, please just know it's part of my healing process. Okay. But when I was invited for this panel, I couldn't help but think about how equitable evaluation is my life's calling, and it's who I am. And when I applied for the foundation, it was as much me selecting the foundation as it was the foundation selecting me. And Bob Ross had me tell my life story in 15 minutes, and he didn't refer once to my resume. And he also is encouraging staff as we go through this very deep racial equity process over 2 years to start to tell our stories, to bring out humanity, and to really know, kind of really open up about who we are, because that's how we relate. So evaluation has never been about the methodology for me. So with that said, I really am appreciative of all the principles that you laid out, and I sit there all the time, and I feel like they're articulated, but over the 20 years in which I practice equitable evaluation, that has come to the fore. And so I think where I want to start my story is to, probably 1% of you don't know, but if you've run into me, you know that I'm such a proud mama. My daughter just graduated from college last week. So the good news is she's returning home, so I'm not an empty nester anymore for you. But as I was so emotional last week at her graduation, I thought about her birth and how significant that time was for me, because I've never shared this. I had a breakdown when I had her, because my family who fled Vietnam intact, all of a sudden, after 20 years of being here, was falling apart. And so I was in my crisis in terms of just thinking through being a new mother, and how do I, as I look down at her beautiful brown eyes, tell her about my origin story, where I want her to know where she came from and who she is, and to really know the Vietnamese part of her Vietnamese, Chinese, American identity, and to never feel less than, like I did when I first came to the United States. And so I thought about which version of my story do I want to tell my daughter. There's the 5-minute story that's very superficial, and it's to just kind of ward off curious strangers. And then there is the longer version that seems to perpetuate the model minority myth. And for me, it's been very problematic, and I've never seen a good enough analysis, so I think that's part of why I'm telling this story. But the model minority myth really denies the complexity of diversity. And I want to really emphasize how when we think about DEI, we rush past the diversity part of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not about the checkbox of all the different bodies you have on your board and your staff, but it's about thinking deeply about what diversity means. And so the model minority myth just immediately lumps together 15 million Asians who live in the United States. And it dictates a narrative of how they should behave and what outcomes that they should be really kind of promoting. And it's very narrow, because as I was going through my crisis and having kind of real psychological kinds of issues that I was trying to work through, it was partly postpartum, I admit, but I was just really struggling with that. And then it also talks about a narrative of good immigrants and bad immigrants. And it pits groups against each other, just in terms of who gets to be here and who has rights. So I have a lot of problem with that. And it also doesn't acknowledge the tensions that exist, because when I'm blent with all these Asians, there are historical tensions. How do we acknowledge that the Chinese invaded and oppressed the Vietnamese people for over 1,000 years? And how do we talk about the Japanese colonialism and the French colonialism? So there are all these things that are happening when you get lumped together. So that was one thing, that longer version kind of connotes that. And then there's also the untold version that could fill the 200-page memoir, because I'm so inspired by Michelle Obama. Maybe I'll write that memoir one day with Becoming. But this version is much darker and much more painful for me, and I rarely tell it. And so because you are my people at GEO, I think I'll share that. And so to understand my story is to understand the Vietnam War. And so it's been over 40 years, and I think it has dimmed in our collective memory. It's been a very painful experience. And so last Monday was Memorial Day, and so my family flew our flag and recognized and remembered the 58,000 soldiers that died in Vietnam. And this war is called the Vietnam War, but did you know that in Vietnam, it's called the American War? And so whose version are we telling about this? And when do we recognize that there was 1.8 million soldiers that also fell in Vietnam and 2 million civilians that died? So it's one of those things where I'm still coming to grips and grappling with what that means to have been a child of war and to come here and to really experience the things that I've experienced. The other part is that it's staggering to realize that there were more bombs dropped in Vietnam and Southeast Asia than there was the entirety of World War II. That's staggering to me. So, and then to know my story is also to think about the underlying structural inequalities, because my family faced that isolation when we came here under this refugee resettlement policy, where there was a deliberate and systematic attempt by the US government to disperse the Vietnamese community so that they wouldn't reform and form a community when we needed it the most, to support each other, natural systems. So that was the consequence in terms of them forcing assimilation of an entire people as we were really needing that support from each other. And then to know my story is also to know that the trauma and the violence didn't stop after we came to the United States. And so maybe that's probably the most painful part for me personally, because I experienced violence within my family, and that was really painful. And so I tell my story because in equitable evaluation, we think a lot about trust and what that means, and the catchword now is move at the speed of trust. I want to share that I never told my story to my loving and supportive husband until after 15 years that we were married. So it takes a long time to build trust, and we expect that to happen now, sense of urgency to get everything done. And so luckily our marriage stayed together, but my brothers did not, in terms of some of the things that they went through. Again, with trust comes from truth-telling, and truth-telling comes in so many different layers, as you could tell from my version of the different versions of my story. And then I think what I want to leave you with the story is that trust, truth-telling, then gets us to a point where how do we hold the truths of communities as the truth? Because I think it takes a long time to get there in terms of the dominant narrative and how you come into that in terms of the understanding. And so I would challenge philanthropy to be thinking about that. And I'm looking at my team members, Janine, Mona, Lori, and we have a board member here. We are very committed to equitable evaluation and what that means as practice. And so we need to really think about that and to kind of hold ourselves accountable to all those different levels. So sorry it took more than my 2 to 3 minutes.
We knew.
Kick us off. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing, this thing about born in California. So after hearing that story, I want you to just look at this, because that's Amy Lynn. And so she seems to have a model minority myth. She has a master's in education, but I looked at that and I said, what's her story? Where did she come from? And why is she one of the models for the undocumented and what that means as we were doing our Health for All campaign? And so I just sat there and really thought about this in terms of this campaign that the California Endowment did that I saw myself in, and said I was not born in California, but California was born in me. And I really believe that because California is a state that embraces immigrants. So just want to share that.
Trilby, who was also not born in California.
I was not born in California. I first want to start by acknowledging that we are gathering today on the unceded and traditional territory of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Nisqually, Snoqualmie, and Muckleshoot tribes. And I feel very grateful to be able to do this work here, and I was so appreciative of the way that the conference was opened this morning with really inviting us to take some time to think about where we are and where we're doing this work, even if we're only here for 2 days or a day and a half. So I want to talk a little bit about why equitable evaluation is compelling and sort of weave the personal and professional. I sort of think of equitable evaluation as this is the evaluation approach you've been looking for. At least for me, it really has reconciled kind of my personal and professional life and has given me a way to bring my whole self to the work that I'm doing, and has this sort of refreshing belief that who you are actually matters and is actually quite critical to the work. So a little bit about who I am. I was born in Vancouver, Canada. I'm the daughter of a university professor and a librarian turned activist. That's my mom, she's right here. Not everyone gets to have their mom at an evaluation conference, so she gets a little shout out. She has also awesome stories, so if you get a chance to meet her, they're worth hearing. And I really was fortunate enough to grow up around people who had a strong sense of justice and were working hard to shift power to those who had less of it. Some of my earliest memories are being in campaign offices with my mom, just kind of hanging out and absorbing that atmosphere in the awesome way that little kids get to. I also attended a youth-led Jewish summer camp where I attended as a camper and then was a leader. And that experience was for me really about building inclusive communities that could be exactly what we wanted them to be in that moment. And so taking those experiences, I feel like maybe evaluation is actually not a natural career choice for me. And like many people, I think, of my age, I didn't grow up wanting to be an evaluator. I didn't even know it was a thing that you could do, but kind of fell into it after grad school when I just needed a job. And I think that often in evaluation, we like to sort of tinker around the edges of things and use a different method or have some new participants or, kind of play around the edges. But what I really love about equitable evaluation is that it provides an opportunity to actually rethink everything, which is, I think, really awesome, scary, and awesome. And as someone who's now worked in evaluation for over 20 years, I've often been frustrated by the limitations of the field and kind of pushed against them. And what I find in equitable evaluation is actually an openness to do that pushing and to work in a fundamentally different way. So with equitable evaluation, I really see the opportunity to use evaluation as a tool for justice and a tool to build power. So that's why I find it compelling.
Great. Your turn.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say I am feeling really humbled to be on the panel with these amazing women, and I want to say a special thanks to Jara for organizing this, even though Gio sort of rejected it, but also gave us a plenary at the same time. Pretty great. It's all about the and, right? Yes. Yeah. So how many people grew up hearing your parents say to you that life is not fair? Yeah, I used to think I was the only one. My dad is from Ireland. He is an orphan. He came to this country when he was 8 years old. Oh, man. I really thought I was going to be okay. So my dad used to tell me life isn't fair all the time. And when your dad comes from that background, you're like, yeah, man, clearly life is not fair. That's not okay. And I noticed a lot of things when I was a little kid that I didn't think were fair. Things about how much Halloween candy I got or didn't get, or what Halloween candy I got or didn't get. Stupid stuff that kids have to learn to accept, right, in life. But then there were things that I started to notice that didn't really fall into the trivial category, that didn't really fall into the luck category, that were really about injustice. They were about noticing the economic situation that my family was in and feeling like something there wasn't quite right. Like, why do my parents live in fear? What is that about? Or, being taught a certain set of norms coming from an Irish Catholic family and then going to an Irish Catholic school, in part because the high school on my side of the city was about to lose its accreditation when the other high school was getting a new football stadium, which also didn't seem quite right. But life isn't fair. And so at a certain point, the Libra in me was just like, well, okay, fine. Life isn't fair, but some of these things are about injustice, and there's no way in which I feel like this is a lesson that people should learn, that this is just fundamentally unfair and we need to accept that and move on. Like, an injustice to me is something that is unacceptable and an invitation for struggle and for inquiry and conversation and potentially activism. And so I have felt drawn to doing this kind of work for a really long time. And I also feel that equitable evaluation has kind of brought us a set of tools that in some way allow us into conversations that hadn't been about equity before, and that still in some ways struggle to be about equity. But having that framework out there in the world provides us with something to move towards. So, you know, the other thing I would just say is, even though I came to kind of my understanding of injustice from a place of noticing economic stuff and experiencing gender stuff, at some point I started to educate myself and learn about other kinds of oppression, other kinds of injustice, and I came to understand myself as a white person, and I came to understand things about xenophobia and colonialism and homophobia and all of these other things, and it was just like, oh gosh, like the unfairness expands. It's just there, and how do we start to bring it in? Like, what is my role in doing that? And so I feel like my journey has been one of learning and also taking responsibility and recognizing that that privilege requires me to do that, both as a person and as a professional. And again, I feel like this approach gives us a set of tools to do that. So thanks, Jira.
That's great. Awesome. Thank you. So you can see why it was really important that they be up here and share their stories with you. And I love that we tiered a little bit because we're human. And I think oftentimes as evaluators, we actually have been asked to remove our humanity from the work. And I think that has done us a tremendous disservice in our relevance and meaningfulness. And at a time when our representational democracy is being challenged, and I call it representational because it was never a full democracy, and when some of the basic human rights and civil rights of many peoples are being, eliminated, probably right now something happened that we don't know about, we really have to use all of our assets in a fundamentally different way. An evaluation, with all of its haters and all of its lovers, has the potential to be an instrument of transformation. But we have to fundamentally reimagine how we think about it, and we need to center something different than knowledge. It has to be about something for something. So we already did this, so we're going to skip that one. So let's talk a little bit about how did you and your organization get started in the work. So we also picked these wonderful people because their foundations are fundamentally different. They started their work in really different places. We, as foundations and evaluators, like models. We like to replicate things because we like simplification. We don't like complexity and mess, and yet it's all very messy. And so it's important that you see the different contexts in which they're working in, so you can begin to see how you might have an entry point that is similar to them. And we also want to make sure there's time for questions, and so we all have prepared answers because we're super prepared. But we'll ask the question and then maybe who's feeling it at this moment to respond. So who wants to respond to this one? Apparently it's you, Trilby. Oh, okay, great. That'd be awesome. Yeah, there you go.
So to start with, I just want to give a bit of context because, we live in a different country, although we're just north of here and took the bus to get here, which was fun. So just a bit about Vancouver Foundation, which is where I work. It is a community foundation. We turned 75 last year, and we serve an entire province, the province of British Columbia. So although we're called Vancouver Foundation, we have a provincial mandate. The work that I'm going to talk about today primarily is about Level, which is a youth initiative of Vancouver Foundation, and because that's the entry point that we have taken in our equitable evaluation work. And Level is a youth engagement initiative. It's shaped by an advisory committee of youth and adult allies, and it aims to address racial inequity. So at Vancouver Foundation, we're investing in the leadership capacity of Indigenous and racialized and immigrant and refugee young people. It's a bit of a mouthful. And so we're wanting to create more opportunities for those folks in the nonprofit and charitable sector. And we're doing that in three main ways. We are granting, we are running a youth policy program, and we are supporting youth organizing. there's a really amazing, powerful team of women who are leading this work at Vancouver Foundation. Jess, who you see up on the screen, is one of our advisors. Our staff team is also incredible. And the work that they're doing to decenter whiteness, to decolonize our practices, to hold up young people, and to work differently is really incredible. And so we needed an evaluation approach that could match that different way of working. Go to the next slide. Yeah. So this is a flip chart. It has a lot of questions on it, and I'm going to talk about questions a lot, and it was super awesome to hear Lisa talk so much this morning about curious questions, because I was like, ooh, that's what I do. I like questions too. So it's good. Thank you for setting that up so nicely. These are some of our questions, and a lot of what we have been doing in our early learning and evaluation work to support level is literally just collecting questions. We're question collectors. We're not moving really quickly to put a lot of definition around things or to put boundaries around things. Our learning and evaluation team is partnering really closely with the level team that runs this work. We just completed a set of site visits where one member of our team and one member of the level team went and visited all of the level grantees and collected more questions. So we have like a big vat of questions. We're working towards a grantee learning day where we'll bring together all of our grantees to talk about all the questions, so we can probably generate more questions. We're thinking a lot about the who, so who does this work. I have thought a lot about what my particular role is in this work and where I should be sitting as someone who has the title and the expertise to conduct evaluation, but I'm probably not the best person to do this work. So we've entered into it really, I guess, with an open and curious mind and thinking about how can we do learning and evaluation work differently to support this initiative, which is all about really dismantling a lot of the ways that we typically work and creating space to work differently.
Great, thank you. There's another one. Do you want to go?
Yes, that's me.
Okay.
Okay, so I would say we approach evaluation with probably several things in mind. And actually, I'd like to back up a little bit because I was kind of a reluctant research evaluator. I came to my graduate study program and my advisor said, great, you can go interview the Vietnamese students. And I'm like, why me? But the very first student I interviewed sat with me for about 10 minutes and shared that her family wasn't perfect and that they had escaped, lost a mother, and that she was contemplating suicide. So that was a big responsibility for me, but it was that moment that I knew I wanted to go into research and evaluation. So I think sometimes trust comes quickly, and sometimes it takes time to build. And I think that speaks to kind of the methodology we use in terms of really supporting the field around the talent pipeline development and how critical that is in terms of really thinking through not only the frameworks, the methodology, the tools, but also the people who are going into evaluation and how they relate to the communities that we're trying to help with equity at the center. And so the other piece is having a very sharp analysis in the framework and the theory of change that we use. And I will be the first to admit I'm mad about theories of change because I think they do play a very important role. And I want to thank Tony Aiton and Martha Jimenez because we have distilled our incredible theory of change for building healthy communities, which is a 10-year, $1 billion initiative that's place-based policy systems change into ABC. So you couldn't get any simpler and be more powerful. And so kind of want to share the analysis through those elements. And agency, in this case, I relate to it so much, is about the ability to exert voice and power in community residents, that we really look towards that, and that equity is the goal, is really about addressing power differentials that we're seeing. Differentials in decision-making and resources, all of these different things that those who have been denied privilege and underinvestment are able to access. and that we're thinking about how to build social, political, and economic power with a critical mass of people. And critical mass doesn't necessarily mean a huge number. It could be less than 1%. But if you have a powerful group with a momentum, they can do a lot of very important, productive things. The second piece is belonging. So belonging is about looking at the dominant narrative of exclusion. And so we're so conditioned now to be really receiving all kinds of messages around how the narrative is dehumanizing the targets. So we hear, as I said earlier, about the good and the bad immigrants, about the givers and the takers, about those people who take drugs. So those get carried all the time in terms of the narrative of exclusion. And then there's this exaggerated notion of scarcity, and that is a zero-sum game, and that resources, then it fosters a incredible amount of competition amongst groups, so acknowledging that. And that there's a sense in the narrative about the nostalgia of the past and fear of the future. And we're definitely seeing that within this context right now. And so the reverse of that is the narrative of inclusion, as we promote belonging. So it entails looking at changing who the narrators of stories, and how important it is to make sure that their voices are heard. And that in telling their story, they get to speak about the shared humanity that we all have with each other. There's also a piece around broaden the lens to show that we have mutual dependency with each other, and that we have shared fate with each other. And that's part of belonging in terms of how we get there. And we highlight abundance, and also look at our context with realism, and trying to promote a shared sense of purpose and hope. So that's part of belonging. And then finally, we often talk about changing conditions. So with policy and systems change, we're hoping to move towards population level outcomes, but you can't do that unless you change the conditions in which communities live. And it's really important for us to think about not beating the odds, because you hear the stories in the newspaper annually about the Latino or the Black student who got into Harvard or Stanford. This is not what our work is about. It's about changing the odds so that everybody gets equal opportunity to the structures that are out there. And so we take that very seriously. And then there's a graphic that shows in terms of how our work is trying to get at health inequalities that are structural and systemic and manufactured by the condition which families and children and youth are living. So one more over. So that's a succinct summary in terms of our theory of change, in terms of really centering power building. We didn't come into our 10-year initiative with that as a central. It was about policy systems change, but we knew that nothing that we invested in after 10 years or what the communities did would be sustainable unless there is the power within community to really hold public officials accountable, and for them to really kind of see through beyond the policy wins. And so power for us as an evaluation exercise became not only a means, but also an end. And that's a really fundamental part of that. And then it leads to policy systems change, the change conditions, and the population. I can talk about a few more, but I think I'll just stop there in terms of some of the methodologies we use.
Yep. So I am mindful of time, and we've been talking a great deal, and so I'm trying to figure out how to get to your questions, and also want to see if there's anything Chulby or Marcy wants to say before we kind of open up questions. Is there anything in particular?
I'm just going to talk a little bit
that's
about
fine.
the way that we have brought equitable evaluation into our work.
Yep, that's great.
Okay. So the Walton Family Foundation, where I work, has a longstanding commitment to evaluation and research. We have had the department for about 10 years. It really plays a key role in shaping board decisions, which, for many people is the evaluation dream, so that's great. We take methods really seriously, super seriously. We also take learning seriously. So when the equitable evaluation thing started to become a thing, I think that was greeted within our foundation with equal parts curiosity, really genuine curiosity of what is this and what might it mean and how does it look, and skepticism. Like,
it's true. I was in that
You're
meeting.
telling me this methodology is like not okay? Because that's what we recognize as the building block of knowledge. And knowledge is like the thing, and objective knowledge and certainty, those are the things. And this really calls that into question. So anyway, we've been grappling with this tension and thinking about what that means for our work. So we started this conversation by bringing Jara into our team retreat, just the SLED team, as we call ourselves. So we were able to learn a little bit. Jara gave us some education about the history of evaluation. That was super useful because we all like learning, we like information. We had some conversations with one another. We talked about some stuff. And then we kept it going. So 6 months later, we had another team retreat, and we made more space to have this conversation, more conversations, brainstorming, this kind of stuff. And coming out of that, we said, okay, enough talking. What are we actually going to do? How do we make this practical? How do we make it real? And what we came to think about was, for us, that's about embedding these principles and practices into the daily work. So we were thinking about what are ways that we can do that, because that's within our sphere of control as a department. I will also say, just for context, that some of our family members are really interested in equity in a meaningful and important way, and that's been a real help. And we've had some foundation leaders who've been real champions for equity, and so that's also been a help. So that's been in the context. But still, we were looking at what we could do within our own work. So if you go to the slides. Yeah, there we go. So these are actually our 2019 priorities. I'm a little off on time right now. I've been traveling. So these are the 4 things that we committed to doing this year in the context of our own work. 1, reviewing grant metrics with an eye to equity. Now I'm going to tell you, we make about 500 grants a year, and 95% of them get grant metrics. So this is not a light lift. This isn't a small thing. This is like every grant that goes out the door gets metrics, and we are thinking about how do we bring an eye to equity on those? So how do we think about disaggregating the data that we get back, as an example? Second, we said we were going to highlight evaluation findings that have equity implications. So when we look at improvements in quality of life in Northwest Arkansas, we are also noting what that is doing to housing prices in Northwest Arkansas. And we are thinking about that and bringing it back into strategy conversations. Third, we are doing the best we can to diversify our pipeline of research and evaluation partners and methods. And lastly, we are supporting programs as they examine equity within their portfolios. So we had a program that was interested in using our analytical methods to look at their grants and see, could we find differences by race or gender of the leadership of a nonprofit in terms of how big the grant was or what the grant duration was. So we actually did a really rigorous analysis of that, which was super interesting for the for that program team to look at. So those are some of the things we've been doing as we continue to have these hard conversations about methods and the nature of knowledge and all that stuff.
Great. And so I think we're going to start to take some questions from the floor. And you can also use your conference app to put some questions in as well. So Emily or Cassie will be walking. I can't see anybody with the blinding light. Okay. So if you put your questions in the app, I think they'll be fielding them.
So we have a first question. How do you respond to evaluators who feel like this isn't new because they've been working in or with community, using participatory methods, etc.? Can you speak to how EE is bigger than a collection of particular methods or approaches?
So I'll speak to that. So it's not a method, one. Participation is important, but it doesn't mean that it is in support of equity. So the principles of EEI don't override any other methodological approach. What they ask you to do is think about how that approach actually advances equity. So it's not an either or, so reject the binary in all things. I mean, there's like 10 things which are really bad, but the rest, reject the binary. And how does participatory evaluation, how might that method, and again, it's a method, it's not a theory, right? Because we're method fixated as evaluators, and as funders, you like method because you like certainty, you like knowledge and you like, a singular truth because that makes your world less complicated or complex. And so that's really what it is. It's not different. What it really is an opportunity to transform how we think about things to be in service of something. Do you want to add to that, or I want to make sure we get enough questions?
I think I would add that it's the starting point, because I was at an American Evaluation Association session last year on empowerment evaluation. There was a whole spectrum, and they spent an inordinate amount of time talking about focus groups, methodologies, and other things, and never once mentioned the word racism or the community's perspective on equity. And so I think where you start the conversation is really critical.
Yep, great. Other questions?
Yeah, so what advice do you have for
Oh, there it's
mid-level
coming.
staff trying to make the case for incorporating an equity lens to our learning and evaluation work and facing internal resistance?
I'm going to let you do it, Marcy.
I would say start by looking what's in the sphere of your own control.
Absolutely.
So, if we're the ones who are advising on grant metrics, then we're the ones asking questions about what those metrics are measuring and what that grant is highlighting in terms of those metrics. So whatever it is, and that's just an example, I know not everyone does grant metrics, but whatever it is that you are personally responsible for, start there, even if it's really small.
Go.
So I think that learning holds a lot of power, and I get by doing a lot of stuff in the name of learning because it's really hard to be opposed to learning. And so because we're funding grants focused on racial equity externally, we made the argument that we needed to do internal work as well, and so it was actually a really nice entry point into doing that internal work. And we're running an internal grants program at Vancouver Foundation, which mirrors our external level grants. So we have staff at the foundation who are level grantees, not using granting money, using program money, just to be clear, who are walking alongside our external grantees and are engaged in very similar projects that are focused internally at Vancouver Foundation. So that was a way that our leverage point was basically, we need to be doing this learning alongside of our grantees. And so I think it relates to what Marcy said, like where you have influence in the organization, use it, and talk about learning a lot, because people love learning.
Other questions?
How can funders support evaluators and evaluation firms to incorporate an anti-racist approach to evaluation?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. How can funders support evaluators and evaluation firms to incorporate an anti-racist approach to evaluation?
So I'm going to answer that and then see if anybody else from the field is. So I think one thing to note is there are evaluators out there who already have that frame. They just don't have the monikers of professionalism and academic rigor that many of you like and are comfortable with. So I want to check that they don't exist, because they do exist. So you may, just as we talked about diversity, you may want to look for different types of people with different types of qualities and characteristics that can actually work in your environment, and also requires you to be different in your expectations from those people. So one of the things, just a little backup around EEI, one of the reasons why we started with philanthropy, not that we don't love you, we do, is that you are a market. And it is really challenging for evaluators who want to and are doing really different things to come to a marketplace that is perhaps not hostile, but certainly not welcoming. And so I want you just to recognize that part of the reason why you might not know who they are is because you haven't looked for them, or they've shown up on your door and you've rejected them. There was some sort of snapping. That's very exciting for the 53-year-old black woman. I don't get a lot of snaps. That's pretty exciting for me. That just made my day. I'm all done.
And I would also recommend the California Endowment did do a multicultural evaluation commissioning toolkit. So it goes through a very deliberate process of thinking through how do you find the evaluator matches with the values that you have. And just to back the last question, you got to walk the talk.
Yeah.
You can't go out and hire all of this. You got to really think about what are your values, practices, champions. Our board made a commitment to racial equity, and they're doing the hard work along with staff. And so you're in the driver's seat as the funders of evaluations.
Absolutely.
But I think people who are committed to this work also look at you and see to what extent are you serious about this. And so they'll look for the kinds of analysis that you've done and how it matches with their experience. I also would say take risks, because there are a lot of big evaluation firms out there that haven't done the deep work. And I want to really thank the Funder and Evaluation Affinity Network, because they're really thinking about the mid-size and the smaller evaluation firms that are really promoting that kind of workforce diversity to do this work.
Great. Other questions?
Yeah, so what are some of the strategies, tactics that your foundation has used to advance agency and empower voices of those with lived experience?
Right, Cholby, I want you to start. That was very directive.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. So I think if we're talking about strategies, not necessarily only evaluation, the Vancouver Foundation has a history of working with young people. The Level initiative grew out of two initiatives, one focused on working with young people aging out of the foster care system, and the other working with immigrant and refugee young people. And those initiatives have really been all about that, and following the lead of those young people in terms of what they see needs to be different in the world. And we, I think, have tried to build evaluation and learning approaches that basically just support that work. And for the first couple of years, I mean, I felt like I was just making up a lot of stuff based on what felt right and what seemed to be needed. And again, so I think the equitable evaluation work has kind of given a name to some of those things. But I think reflecting back on the last question, I mean, I would even question, like, do you need to have evaluators that are doing the evaluation, or can the young people that are at the center of this work just do the evaluation? Like, what is the expertise that we're looking for, and who really has that? And often it's those young people. It's not anyone who's called an evaluator. So that was a meandering, long answer to say that I think that that you have to hold, in our case, the young people at the center, listen to what they're saying, and then sort of tailor your approach according to what seems to be needed to make the changes that they're looking for.
Great. Are there other questions? I'm mindful of time, and then I also want to make sure we close.
Our final question is, what does equitable evaluation mean, or how do you apply it in non-US, non-Western contexts?
Well, we're only 5 months in, so like, give us a minute. So that's one. So in all honesty, so this work actually came out of a UNICEF monolith that was on equity-focused evaluation, which was really trying to understand evaluative practices in international development and what it looked like to look at equity. There has been interest in what it looks like in other countries, but I'm super strategic and I understand my lane, and it's hard enough to figure out how to do it in this country, and then like Hawaii, right? Which I know you're part of the country, but it's a different context. I'm looking at Tom right there. Right, so there's enough complexities in the US that our focus is in the US, and what we actually are looking for is people in other contexts who want to see what it looks like to bring these principles to bear in their context. Like, I couldn't possibly speak about that. I mean, I'm from like Philadelphia and I live in Marin. I got a lane. I'm like super clear about what it is. But we want people who think about these principles and how they would translate to other places. So that's the invitation, is that if you are one of those people who don't work in the US and you have another context, take the principles, try them on, get engaged with the partnership, and let's talk about what it looks like and how we can evolve practice. Because none of you do anything anyplace else, right? You're all California. Well, I mean, you're Canada, but enough of you. Enough of you. All right, let's just do some closing words of wisdom. When I mean closing words, like Twitter length. Yeah, you were supposed to think about this. Yeah, there was a warning. Yeah.
Okay.
Go. Do the hearts and mind thing.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah, do that.
Okay. So one of the things that I feel is a limitation in this work is living too much up here. Too much in the analytical space, too much in the framework and methods and what does it mean and tossing it all around or whatever, and just not enough here. And as we could tell from the way we started this panel, for most of us who care about this work, it never started in our heads, right? It started somewhere deeper than that. And I think getting back to that and letting that be part of the work and listening to it when it's screaming at you because you're not doing something you ought to be doing or not asking the question that's on your mind or whatever it is, I think listening to that is important. And the other thing I'll say is just, and this is something that everyone on every panel always says, so I'm just absorbing it and spitting it back out again, but it's like run to the hard stuff. Don't avoid it.
Great. Trilby?
So I would say that if you're looking for alignment between the evaluation practice that you have and the justice and equity work that you do, then these are your people. And I would also say what Jara said to me a lot at the beginning was like, just get started. Just do things and learn along the way.
And then I would say two things. Do the deep culture work at your foundations so that you can really walk the talk. And then the other thing is, don't let your sense of urgency that the evaluation report needed to be submitted yesterday to the board drive you, because you're going to have to do it again and do it right and make it authentic.
Yeah, those are great. So a couple sort of heads up around what's coming. I'm not going to read these things out to you because you guys can all read them. But that's sort of where we are in terms of offerings that'll be coming up. Our partnership with GEO has been really powerful. And so we're really excited about that. I do want to just note that there's a peer-to-peer collaboratory that'll be starting in the fall. Walton and the Missouri Foundation for Health will be offering an invitation out to that. Again, the idea is that the invitations need to come from you, not from us, right? So it's you asking each other to engage in your evaluative work differently. And so who's your influencer? Like, who do you influence? And can you invite them to a party to actually evolve the practice together? So that's kind of exciting for us. And I wanted to end with this because, like, this is really what this is about. Someone was remarking to me earlier that they felt like a panel didn't touch on, like, the realities of this moment. And so for me, when I do this work, it's because I'm trying to change the world. And if I happen to learn something along the way, that's a bonus, but it's actually not a privilege I have. My learning has to be in service of something that changes lives for those that will follow me. And so that's what guides my learning. And that's, I think, what EE actually offers up to people, is an opportunity to recalibrate their heads and their hearts to be about something more than that. And so if you aren't part of the party, I mean, it's a pretty good party. I mean, it's early on, but, you know, they seem fun and smart. Please find a way to engage with us, because this is our collective work. If we want to leave this planet better off than it is at this particular moment. So I want to thank these lovely humans beside me. Their partnership and their friendship has been invaluable. And there's many friends and family that are actually in the room here. So I want to thank all of you. And Gio, thank you for the opportunity.